What if the worst thing that ever happened to your career was the exact thing that saved it? Because one brutal rejection can force you off the ladder before you spend a decade climbing the wrong one. And once you see how someone goes from consulting to investing to building boots online, the whole idea of a safe path starts to look kind of delusional. So the real question is, are you building something that matters, or just optimizing your way into a life you never actually wanted? Let's get into it. Wait, he was in consulting, then investing, then boots? That is such a wild career pivot chain. But honestly, that path makes weird sense. He saw consumer brands from the investor side first, right? That is basically how you learn what sells and what is fantasy. Especially if you end up selling boots on the internet. Boots feels like the opposite of a sexy startup category. Which is exactly why it probably worked. Because nobody wakes up obsessing over boots, but everyone needs a pair. Well, maybe not everyone, but Texas definitely does. That category has identity built into it, which is huge. I keep thinking about that rejection part, too. Harvard and Stanford saying no can actually save your life. That is brutal, but he needed that slap. Because he was on the comfortable ladder, doing the obvious next step. And then he realized he was just optimizing, not building. Which is a very expensive way to be bored. Bro, that is the whole elite career trap. You get paid well, you look successful, and nothing in you is lit up. That bar conversation is funny, though. You need liquid courage to quit a great job and sell boots? That is the most human founder origin ever. It is not always divine clarity. Sometimes it is just a beer and a friend. What I like is he did not start by saying, I was obsessed with boots since childhood. Thank God, because that story is usually fabricated. Yeah, a lot of founders retroactively cosplay destiny. He basically said he wanted to start a brand, then looked for the right category. That is actually a more honest way to build. But boots, why not shoes or jackets or some normal category? Because boots have culture, margin, and repeat demand. And the Western space was weirdly old school, which meant direct-to-consumer could hit hard. That is the move, right? Find a category where the incumbents are asleep, or where they think internet shoppers are beneath them. Which is always a dangerous belief, especially when customers want convenience but still care about quality. And boots are emotional, not just functional. People are buying identity, not leather. That line needs to be on a billboard somewhere. Direct-to-consumer works best when the product tells a story immediately. With boots, you can feel the lifestyle before the ad even loads. Still, selling expensive boots online sounds risky. It is risky if people do not trust the fit and quality. Which means the brand has to remove fear, not just create demand. The internet is an anxiety machine, so good luck. Exactly, especially when the product is something people wear on their feet. You cannot fake comfort in a boot for long. I think that is why stores matter too. Wait, that expansion into retail is the smartest part. Online gets you scale, but stores get you confidence. And boots are tactile, so touch still closes the deal. You can scroll a boot, but you cannot really believe a boot. That sounds ridiculous, yet it is completely true. Once they had a product market fit online, stores became an amplifier. Not a retreat, not some panic move. Retail is only dumb when you open it before you know what you are doing. That is such a clean rule, actually. He waited until the brand was already working, then added the experience layer. So the stores are not just stores, they are brand theaters. Yes, and boot stores especially can feel like a clubhouse. A very stylish clubhouse with expensive shelves. That is how you turn a category into a destination. I also like that he was already investing in consumer businesses. It probably trained him to see patterns in what customers actually do. Though being an investor and being a founder are not the same game. Not even close. One is PowerPoint, one is pain. That is unfairly accurate. Investors can spot opportunity, but founders live inside the mess, which is why the rejection probably helped him cross over. Sometimes you need the universe to close the side door. Then you stop waiting for permission. There is also something interesting about Texas here. Like this brand would feel very weird if it started in Manhattan. A Manhattan cowboy boot company sounds like a parody. Texas gives it legitimacy without needing explanation. The founder story, the product, the market, all of it fits. Geography matters when the product has a personality. That is so true and so annoying for people trying to force brands. He did not invent the cowboy boot, he modernized access to it. That distinction is important because it is not just novelty chasing. Novelty brands die fast when the joke wears off. But durable brands solve a real buying problem and still feel fresh. Here, the problem was probably choice, trust, and convenience. And he made the category feel premium without making it precious. That is a tricky balance, especially in Western wear. If you get too precious, you lose the actual buyer. If you get too mass, you lose the soul. Brand building is basically walking a tightrope in expensive shoes, or expensive boots in this case. And the fact that they are still fully direct-to-consumer is wild. Half online, half stores, but still one customer relationship. That is the real genius, not picking one channel and worshiping it. Just using whichever touchpoint makes the customer trust you more. Shocking concept. Let the customer decide how they want to buy. Revolutionary in 2026, apparently. Honestly, the whole thing reads like discipline more than luck. He had timing, sure, but also the guts to execute for years. Which is the part people always skip when they romanticize entrepreneurship. They want the reveal moment, not the grind. And his reveal moment was basically, I am not fulfilled enough. That is less cinematic, more honest. But that honesty is why the story lands. It feels like a smart guy deciding to stop living on rails. And then building a category leader out of a niche many people ignored. That is the kind of move that looks obvious only after it works. Which is the most insulting compliment in business. Seriously, obvious means everyone else missed it. Anyway, I love that this started with discomfort, not a master plan. Sometimes that is the only real beginning. That rejection almost feels like a redirection, not a setback. Harvard and Stanford basically said, go find your own lane. And that can be the most useful kind of humiliation. What I love is he did not romanticize it at all. No destiny music, just a bad week and a beer. That is way more believable than the usual founder mythology. He was already doing well and still felt empty. That is the part people skip when they talk about entrepreneurship. Everyone thinks it starts with ambition, but sometimes it starts with boredom. Or one extremely awkward rejection email. And then there is the boot thing, which is genuinely funny. Because boots sound old school until you realize the market was hiding in plain sight. He did not pick a sexy category. He picked a category with identity. That is a huge difference, right? Sexy categories get copied fast. Identity categories get defended. Also, boots have opinions built into them. Nobody is emotionally attached to a spreadsheet, man. But people are attached to how they want to look and feel. That is where DTC gets interesting, because he is not just selling leather. He is selling taste, confidence, and a very specific version of self-image, which is hard to do if the product does not match the promise. Exactly, and that is why boots are a brutal category. Fit is unforgiving, quality is visible, and people know what they like. You cannot fake a boot person for long. They will sniff out of the fraud immediately. So if Tecovas won online, the product had to be absurdly consistent. And that is harder than selling hype. Hype can carry a hoodie. It cannot carry a boot for very long. Plus, the category itself has this weird tension between heritage and modern retail. Because if you go too modern, you lose the soul. If you go too heritage, you stay small and dusty. Small and dusty is a wild business strategy. But that is basically where a lot of legacy brands live. He seems to have found the narrow lane where both can coexist. That balance is probably the whole game. Still, moving from online to stores is where a lot of DTC stories get exposed. Because suddenly you are not just a website anymore, you are a real place. And real places have rent, staff, experience, all of it. The internet is forgiving, landlords are not. That should be on a t-shirt in every founder office. The store move tells you they had enough confidence in repeat demand. Or maybe enough data to know people wanted to touch the product. Boots are tactile in a way sneakers are not, weirdly. You do not buy boots with your eyes alone. Unless you are making terrible decisions on the internet at 1 a.m., which, to be fair, is half of e-commerce. What also stands out is he built the brand without pretending stores were the whole answer. It stayed direct, just with more surfaces for customers to meet it. That feels smarter than the old online versus offline drama, because that fight is usually fake anyway. Brands act like they are in exile if they open one store. Right, like they betrayed the internet gods. But customers do not care about ideology. They care about convenience and trust. And Tecovas seems to have made both feel premium. That is such a hard thing to do at scale. especially in a category where legacy players probably looked at them like a joke. Until the joke had 30 stores. Then suddenly everyone is doing strategy memos. I also think his background matters more than people realize. Consulting and investing gave him pattern recognition, not just ambition. He knew how consumer businesses break, not just how they look from the outside. But that can also be dangerous, because smart people over-engineer things. Absolutely, a spreadsheet can ruin a brand if you let it. Yet he seems to have used the intelligence without killing the instinct. That is probably the real edge. Knowing when to trust the numbers and when to trust the room. Also, starting in Austin instead of New York is quietly important. Because Austin gives you enough culture without making you feel like you need permission. New York can make even Boots feel like they need a pitch deck. That is nasty, but true. Texas probably gave the brand some authenticity, too. Not in a fake cowboy way, but in a lived-in way. Customers can smell performative Americana instantly. Especially when it comes with a logo and a slogan. Yeah, nothing says heritage like a brand book. So his edge was probably respecting the category while modernizing the path to buy it. Which sounds simple, but that is basically the entire business. And the part I keep coming back to is how personal the pivot was. He did not quit because he hated his life. He quit because he wanted more meaning. That is a way more mature reason than ego. Ego still showed up, obviously, just with better manners. The polished chip on the shoulder. And honestly, that chip can be useful if it does not turn toxic. It can make you stay hungry after the easy wins come. Most people collapse right after the first validation. Or they get lazy because they think the market is grateful to them. The market is never grateful, by the way. The market is literally rude, which makes a company like this more impressive because it had to earn every layer. Online first, then stores, then scale without losing the core. That is not luck, that is restraint. And the restraint might be the most underrated founder skill here. Like knowing what not to build is part of knowing what to build. That is annoyingly wise. I hate when business stories turn into life lessons, but this one does. Because underneath the boots and stores, it is really about conviction. Conviction to leave, conviction to choose a weird category, conviction to wait. And conviction to keep the brand coherent as it grows. That last part is where most people break. Yeah, because growth starts asking you to become everything at once. Tecova sounds like it resisted that temptation pretty well. Boots first, Empire second. Which is probably the only sane order. Yeah, and that is why it feels real instead of manufactured. The funny part is he did not start as some cowboy boot prophet. He was just a smart guy in a suit having a late-night crisis. That is way more relatable than the founder mythology people sell now. Everybody wants the childhood origin story, and he is like, no, I got rejected. Harvard and Stanford saying no is basically a villain origin story. Or a very expensive career pivot notification. But that rejection thing is real because it forces a clean stop. When the path gets blocked, you finally ask what you actually want. Most people never get blocked hard enough to ask that question. They just keep collecting promotions like trading cards. And then one beer later, suddenly you are thinking about building a company. That is such a dangerous sentence. Every terrible yet brilliant idea starts with, we were having a drink. But honestly, that is where the honesty comes out. In the office, everybody performs competence. Over a beer, people admit they are bored. And boredom is usually the actual founder fuel. Not ambition, not wisdom, just, I cannot do this forever. The interesting move was choosing Boots, though. Because that is not a sexy tech category, it is a very specific world. Which is exactly why it works. Everybody runs toward categories they think are huge and obvious. And then they all fight in the same pool for the same attention. Boots are weird because people already understand the product emotionally. You are not inventing desire, you are organizing it. That is a huge difference. But the hard part is people think a category being old means it is finished. It usually just means no one has packaged it well enough. And Tecovas basically said, wait, why are boots still sold like this? Why are we pretending a boot has to live in a dusty old retail ritual? Direct-to-consumer makes the category feel modern without changing the product soul. That is the balance, right? If you over-modernize, you kill the authenticity. If you under-modernize, you just have a nice boot funeral. A boot funeral is crazy. But it is true, people can smell fake heritage instantly. So the move is not to invent a story, it is to sharpen the real one. He kept saying direct, but what matters is control. Control of product, control of experience, control of brand. And probably control of pacing, which people ignore. Because if you grow too fast, you can ruin the thing people loved. But if you grow too slow, someone else becomes the category. Business is just choosing which fire to stand near. That is an awful sentence and somehow correct. Opening stores in 2019 was the other interesting bet. People love to act like stores are dead or sacred. Both takes are lazy. For a brand like this, stores are not just inventory boxes. They are physical proof that the brand deserves real estate. They also solve trust in a category where fit matters a ton. You can click a boot online, but your feet still want an opinion. Your feet are the final investors. That is actually the best due diligence ever. And once they had stores, the brand stopped being abstract. It became a place, not just a website. That shift is huge because a lot of DTC brands never earn a place. They earn clicks, not belonging. Belonging is the harder business. I also liked that he talked about being in consumer investing first. That background changes how you think about brands. You stop worshiping vibes and start noticing unit economics. Horrible for parties, excellent for survival. But sometimes investors are too allergic to messy realities. Founders need optimism that would embarrass normal people. Investors need restraint or they finance every fantasy. He seems like he had both lenses before starting. That is probably why he did not build a random boot hobby brand. He built a system. And systems are boring until they become massive. Then suddenly everybody calls it vision. The same spreadsheet gets a documentary once revenue shows up. That is painfully true. What I keep coming back to is his patience. He did not sound like a guy trying to win next quarter. He sounded like somebody building a brand for the next decade. And that is rare because everyone is addicted to speed now. Speed is useful, but patience is what lets quality compound, especially in a product people wear on their body. If the thing feels cheap, the whole illusion dies. Boots are unforgiving like that. Very judgmental footwear. It is funny that a category this old got rebooted by someone thinking like a modern brand builder. Not disrespecting this category, just refusing to accept bad distribution. Which is a fancy way of saying, why is this so annoying to buy? Honestly, that is the whole internet. The best founders often begin with irritation, not inspiration. They see friction everyone else has normalized. Then they build around that friction until it feels obvious. That is probably why the brand feels so clean. It did not start as a trend chase. It started as a stubborn answer to a real problem, which is always better than we saw a market opportunity on a slide. Slides are where conviction goes to get watered down. And the people who actually build usually want less theory, more proof. You can feel that in the way he talks about the brand. Calm, specific, not oversold. That calmness is earned. Because once a brand has real customers, you stop needing to shout. The product does some of the talking for you, which is the most expensive luxury in business. I guess the whole lesson is that the best pivots are not random. They are usually a mix of dissatisfaction, timing, and self-awareness. And maybe one drink too many. Which honestly is how civilization moves. Anyway, that part felt very human to me. One beer and suddenly a boot company exists. That is the cleanest founder origin story I have heard all week. But the weird part is he did not wake up obsessed with boots. He basically built the muscle first, then picked the arena. That feels almost backwards compared to the usual cult founder mythology. No childhood lemonade stand, no tiny hustler movie montage. Just grades, consulting, and a very expensive sense of optionality. And honestly, that is probably more common than people admit. Most people do not know their thing at 16. They just know they want leverage later. The Harvard and Stanford rejection part is so funny too. The universe said, try being annoying in a different direction. Sometimes rejection is just a better career counselor. It forced him to stop following the obvious script. And that is the whole story, right? Not talent alone, but getting boxed out of autopilot. Which is annoying because you kind of need life to push you. Yeah, life has to basically shove you off the treadmill. Then he goes from there to, okay, what is different about me? That question is actually brutal. Most people never answer it honestly. They just keep optimizing a path that already exists. And then one day they are 40 and spiritually allergic to Mondays. That's a terrible sentence, but it is true. What I liked is he did not frame entrepreneurship as destiny. He framed it like a choice he had to earn, which is more honest than I was born to build. Bro, nobody was born to do deck slides. That would be a cursed baby. But then the actual category choice is wild. Cowboy boots are not the first thing you think of for DTC. That is the genius, though. He picked a category with identity, loyalty, and terrible retail options. Terrible retail options is such a business thesis. That's basically saying, we saw the store and said, absolutely not. And boots are one of those things people actually care about fit. Once fit matters, direct-to-consumer starts making real sense. Because if you sell something generic, online is just a discount battlefield. But if you are selling identity plus fit, you can build trust. And then the boots become a uniform, not just a product. That is when margins start wearing a hat and looking expensive. Still, it is risky as hell. Because boots are touchy, literal touchy. People want leather drama, not a checkout page. That's actually a good line. So the brand had to make the internet feel tactile. That is harder than it sounds. Also, selling boots direct means you are betting customers will trust you without a middleman. That is a big leap for a niche heritage category. People do not casually impulse buy cowboy boots from a random website. Unless the website looks stupidly good. Or unless the story is so coherent it removes friction. And then he starts opening stores in 2019, which is another interesting move. Because usually people say digital first like it is a religion. Then reality walks in wearing a belt buckle. Dude, yes. The stores are not a betrayal of DTC, they are an extension of it. That is what I think people miss. He was not giving up on the online model, he was adding trust. And maybe adding economics too, because stores can deepen the relationship. Exactly, but it is a dangerous expansion if the product is weak. Tecovas had the opposite problem. They had demand and then needed more surface area. That is a much better problem. The kind of problem investors pretend they always had. Too many customers, too much money, not enough stores. What I respect is the discipline in not over-romanticizing growth. He kept saying direct to consumer, but half online, half retail. That is not a slogan, that is a system. Most people would have turned it into a vanity brand and opened stores too early. Or they would have stayed purely online and capped the experience. Boot shopping is too physical to be trapped in a laptop forever. That sounds like a fake sentence, but it is not. His background in consumer investing probably helped him see that. He had seen enough brands to know where the seams were. Still, being an investor and being a founder are very different sports. One is judging the race, the other is getting kicked by the horse. And one has way less sleep. But that transition probably gave him a useful pattern recognition advantage. He could see what customers actually wanted versus what founders were fantasizing about. That matters more than people think. Because a lot of brands are just wishful thinking with a logo. Brutal, but yes. And his whole story is kind of about rejecting the comfortable script. Good grades, good job, good city, good pay, still not enough. That realization is terrifying for a lot of people. Because once you notice it, you cannot unsee it. You start looking at your own life like a spreadsheet with bad assumptions. Yeah, and then your soul is like, we need a reforecast. The funny thing is, he did not seem reckless at all. He sounded methodical, just restless, which may be the best founder combo. Because pure chaos burns money, but pure caution builds nothing. Restless with a plan is basically rocket fuel, and occasionally a migraine. Also, the Texas piece matters more than it looks. He is from Texas, moved back, and the category fits the culture. That kind of authenticity cannot be faked at scale. You can fake vibes for a launch, not for a decade. Eventually, the internet notices. The internet always snitches. So the real lesson is not start a boot company. It is build from real conviction in a category with real pain for real customers. And then be willing to evolve the channel when the business tells you to. That is the part that feels adult. Adult, but still slightly cowboy. Which is honestly the best brand personality. He found a way to make scale feel grounded. That is rare. Most companies scale by becoming abstract. Tecovas scaled by making the customer relationship more concrete. That is why it works. And why the story does not feel fake. It feels like somebody looked at a real category and actually solved it. Which is rarer than people want to admit. Yeah, way rarer.